thank you. That was quite a generous introduction. And so without further ado, I'll get started. And what I'm talking about really is logistics and what the Confederate Quartermasters in Houston, Texas did for the Confederate logistics. And we hear about our battlefield heroes all the time, but we hear less about the men who kept the war machine running. And without the logistics behind the Army can't stay in the field. And so this always fascinated me, and I've researched the topic, and this talk will elaborate a little bit on that. For me, this is significant because we Southerners lost the war in the field, but we won, let me go back, but we won the logistical struggle, as I'll allude to. And one of the Southerners had to overcome many things. They had to build an industry from scratch to be able to even engage in this war. They dealt with scarcity. They dealt with invasion, having to run a logistical operation in the midst of numerous invasions all over the South. But they did it all. And after the war, the Army was beaten by superior numbers, but the industry was there. And one of the visions that the Southerners had before the war was self-sufficiency. And it was the war that really pushed the Southern leadership towards self-sufficiency. So we'll talk about that. And we may have lost on the battlefield, but we prevailed in industry. And I'm originally from Houston, Texas. It was where I was born. So I always have a connection to Houston, and I'll be talking about two quartermaster officers from Houston, Texas. So how to begin? Let me see if this is going to work. Oh, it does. Okay. So I didn't know if I was going to have to use the mouse or that. So before I talk about the Civil War, sometimes I like to allude to World War II because it's very relatable. It's a little bit closer to where we're at. And logistics is about enabling the fight, enabling the Army to stay in the field. And what governments do is they have to set up a teeth-to-tail ratio. They have to put a certain amount of their resources and manpower into logistics and a certain part into the fighting front. So part is sustainment, part is fighting. And this is called the teeth-to-tail ratio. And in World War II, the Germans, they had 2 soldiers on the front for every 1 soldier in sustainment, in logistics. The Americans, the Allies in general, the British, the Soviets, the Americans, they had 1 soldier on the front lines for 2 soldiers in sustainment. So why? Well, it comes down to manpower for both the Germans and the Confederates. The Germans were fighting the whole war, the whole world, and so they couldn't invest in sustainment and logistics like they wanted to. And if you can understand that, then you can also understand the Confederacy. The Confederacy had a really hard time with sustainment and logistics. Why? Because in 1861, the North outnumbered the South in manpower 4.5 to 1. And by 1865, they outnumbered us 5-1. And so this was really pretty much worse than the German Wehrmacht against the Soviets. I mean, it was that the overwhelming numbers were worse. So are you starting to see why we lost the war? Okay, so, you know, this was the thing, but how did it affect logistics? Well, if you are trying to put most of your men on the front lines just to face down this humongous juggernaut coming against you, then you're going to have trouble putting people in sustainment in the logistics field. And this theme is going to reoccur as I talk about it. And so this was the situation with Confederate logistics. And this was the challenge that our unsung patriots, the quartermaster officers in Houston, faced. So, as I said, despite all the challenges they had to overcome, they did succeed. They did make their part of the puzzle in the South self-sufficient, and they were successful. And I'll be talking about these men. One is Captain Edward Clifton Wharton, and the other is Captain William J. Mills, and how they achieved their vision. So we'll start with Edward Clifton Wharton. We don't have a picture of him in his uniform, unfortunately. This a picture when he's like 22 years old, and then one when he's like 50. Now this is Wharton. And who was he? So Wharton ended up being the chief quartermaster in Houston, Texas, and then he became the chief quartermaster for the District of Texas. He was a man who had a mercantile background. His family brought him up as kind of a mercantile type professional in the 1850s in New Orleans. And then right before the Civil War, he came to Galveston, where he became the editor of the Galveston Daily News. So Wharton was a man who had not only entrepreneurial experience, he had organizational and managerial experience. So when the war came, I think he saw that a good fit for him was the Quartermaster Corps. That's where he could best help the Confederacy. Now, again, we come back to a lack of manpower. So Wharton in Houston was given responsibility for 4 different bureaus: the Quartermaster Bureau, the Commissary, the Paymaster, and the Post Quartermaster. So normally, each of these functions has a separate officer with a separate staff working it. Wharton, because they just didn't, the Confederacy there, they didn't have enough people, he kind of got all this lumped on him. And so there was already a lot of stress. You know, they're not really, he wasn't fully staffed. And so, in fact, he kind of ran this operation like that, trying to do about 4 jobs at once, until 1863, January 1863, when they finally relieved him of commissary and paymaster responsibilities, and he could concentrate only on manufacturing and post-quartermaster duties. So this was one of the challenges. This is Wharton's uniform, by the way. It does exist. It's in Ray Ritchie's museum in Fort Worth. So Wharton was doing all these quartermaster jobs in Houston, and he would take on more responsibility later in 1863. But what is noteworthy too is that somehow he ended up with only a provisional commission. His commission was never taken to the Secretary of War, so he never got an official Confederate commission until later, and this would also have an impact upon his career, as we'll see. So, looking at Wharton, during his tenure as the quartermaster in Houston, he accomplished quite a bit. He built an entire manufacturing complex from scratch. He fostered innovations and advances to manufacturing, and he accomplished it all during wartime, amid scarcity. He had a weak currency to deal with, so he couldn't just go out and buy things because of inflation. He dealt with unreliable imports, and also there was a weak infrastructure. There wasn't, a vast network of railroads and stuff like that. So he had to deal with that. And in the fall of 1863, as most of you probably know who have studied the Civil War, the Northern armies under General Banks were invading Texas along 3 points, in Brownsville, and then in Indianola, and on the Sabine River. So there was a big panic, and the authorities in Texas, led by Magruder, they started pulling stuff back from the coast. So he had to, in the midst of everything he was doing, he had to relocate part of his operation to Hempstead, Texas, and Milliken. Milliken really doesn't exist anymore. It's now Navasota, Texas, you could call it. So he had these challenges. So what was Wharton's job as quartermaster in Houston, Texas? Well, his job was to supply Southern troops with clothing and equipage at first in the eastern sub-district of Texas, the greater area around Houston, and then later for the entire district of Texas. So he had to supply regular Confederate troops, Texas state troops, the gunboat service, the Labor Bureau, which was kind of the engineer corps made up of blacks, and that was about 20% of the force in Texas, so it was significant. He had to supply Confederate officers who were on a separate account, and he had to clothe men in hospitals, men on furlough, detailed men, and prisoners of war. And so there were about 20,000 troops in all, to include the Labor Bureau and the Texas state troops, who were activated 2 times in 1863. So the Guard was called out twice, in the spring of 1863 and then in the big scare when the Union Army was invading the Texas coast. So Wharton's immediate concern in 1861, when he assumed his responsibilities, was how to provide for troops short term. He didn't really know how long the war was going to last. And so his answer was to purchase supplies from abroad using cotton as payment. And why not? That's what Southerners always did. They always bought from abroad using cotton for payment. In addition, he would contract for things. So his idea of making stuff in Confederate shops was at first not the first answer he had. But as the war progressed and he realized this is going to last for a while, Wharton set his sights on home manufacturers. And all Southern leaders, community leaders, they all were inspired by this vision of building the home industry. In other words, we want to be independent of the North. We want to be independent of Europe. We want to make our own stuff. So he had that. And paraphrasing Wharton, he said, "Manufacturing has from the first interested me deeply. Due to the precarious nature of the Rio Grande trade, the imports, I felt it was the quartermaster officer's duty to encourage home manufacturers and show the world that we could be self-supporting, despite the suddenness of the call on us for such labors and their novelty to us as agriculturalists, not mechanics and machinists. So he wanted to build the home industry. So how was he going to do this? Well, the answer was, before he could do anything, he had to build an infrastructure. It wasn't there. Southern industry just wasn't there in the way that it's here today. And so the first thing he had to do before he could make a pair of boots or make a knapsack or anything, the first thing he has to do is he has to build a carpenter shop. And so using a steam-driven circular saw, big circular saw, he started to mill lumber. And from this lumber, he was able to build his workshops, workers' tenements, bureau offices, stables, corrals, fences, warehouses with shelving and partitions, as well as boxes to ship his products, because without the boxes you can't ship the products, and of course without a transportation network you can't ship the products. So he also built a blacksmith shop, a wheelwright shop, a harness shop, a saddle maker shop, all the facilities necessary to provide transportation to the Bureau. For he needed not only a plant to manufacture the items, he needed a means of transportation to move these items to the Army. So before he could even produce anything, he had to build an entire infrastructure. But that wasn't all. He had to gather a workforce of expert tradesmen to operate his factories, tradesmen and managers. And this was perhaps even more difficult than building the infrastructure because the South just didn't have the population and didn't have all these surplus mechanics and managers around. So but he did manage to gather a number of people, and the government did exempt qualified tradesmen and expert tradesmen, and so he was able to assemble a workforce. It was a little haphazard, but he did that. And once all of this was in place by early 1862, then he could begin to fulfill his dream of these home manufacturers, of making the South and Texas self-sufficient, produce their own war material. So the very first thing that was his priority was to make tents, and what he called his tent loft. So why? Because it was the winter of 61-62, and the troops up in Arkansas were complaining bitterly of a lack of shelter. And before anything else was needed, they needed to shelter the men. So he needed tents more than anything, and that was his first priority. And what is interesting is a surprising lack of provinciality with Wharton. He did not say, oh, well, that's Arkansas, let them worry about that. I'm worried about my district here in Texas. No, he thought of the greater good. We need to not think of ourselves here in warm, balmy, sunny Texas coast. We need to get tents to Arkansas where there's snow everywhere. So that was his first venture. And he started off by making tents and tent flies of various sizes, and also wagon sheets for his wagons to cover up everything. He also made corn and flour sacks, so he's making sacks to move the food in as well. Aside from the tents, wagon sheets, listers, corn sacks, flour sacks, that kind of thing. He also made a number of items like enameled cloth, kind of a waterproof cloth, painted and shellacked cloth. He made haversacks, knapsacks, things like that. So there was that. Now, the tent loft, in the tent loft, he had old sailors, because there were some sailors, you know, in Galveston. He got these old retired sailors to cut up the tents. They had experience with that. And then to put the tents together, he had the families of soldiers, the wives and mothers and daughters and that, to come, and he paid them to put the tents together. And so that's how he started that. And he used, for his tent material, he used Huntsville Penitentiary textiles, Osnaburg's, a lighter weight cotton cloth, and then cotton jeans, more of a heavier weight cotton cloth. And this is an interesting thing that he said, that his tent loft refurbished damaged tents as well as made them. And he mentioned many tents have passed through the tent loft several times, coming in disabled from active service in the field and sent back like the veterans from the hospital, scarred and disfigured mayhap, but ever ready for another rough campaign. Would that the same process could extend to the veterans as to the old tents that cannot each be made whole again, but parts of 2 or 3 or more are picked out and made useful again as flies, haversacks, corn sacks, or wagon covers. Now, at first, Wharton made tents and flies in 3 different sizes, but he soon realized that he really needed to streamline the operation, that if he just made one standard tent, he could speed up the operation. And so he settled on a standard tent, a 9 by 12 wall tent, and a 9 by 12 foot fly. And according to Wharton, this is what he said, that this 9 by 12 foot wall tent housed 9 men comfortably. Wow. Or served as an officer or staff tent. Larger tents are too unwieldy, succumbing to heavy winds and storms, and smaller tents are too uncomfortable. So the first picture I showed you of Camp Holly, Arkansas, those may have very well been used in tents. This is a picture of an actual Confederate tent in Pensacola, Florida. It's probably a little smaller than Wharton's, but you get the idea. It's a wall tent with a fly put over the top of it, and that gave a little pocket of air and to keep the tent cooler and made it a little more waterproof. And when the soldiers needed a kind of something to sit under for trade, they built brush arbors. So if you look in the background of that picture, you see the typical brush arbor they made to sit under, and they used their fly over the top of the tent. So Wharton also experimented with making a revolutionary one-man tent that could be folded up into a knapsack during the day and carry the soldiers' belongings, and at night he unfolded his knapsack and made it into a one-man tent with little holes and pins. But that was just too much trouble. So Wharton gave up that idea. So, expanding his manufacturers. So in December of 1862, Wharton started 2 new shops, and that was a shoe shop and a tailor shop. He needed to clothe the troops, of course. Now, 2 things had prompted Wharton to make his tailor shop. One, from September to November of 1862, he had received 45,000 yards of cadet gray cloth imported from England. So he had a huge amount of cloth he could turn into clothing. And two, prior to that time, contractors made the uniforms. But the contractors paid their workers really pitiful wages, and he was convinced, you know what, I can hire these families of soldiers, you know, who are not getting much pay. I can give them more money, and they can make clothing for the government shop, and they'll be happier, and I'll be doing a service. And so he had mentioned that the mothers, wives, daughters, and sisters of soldiers had flocked to Euston as refugees, and now he wanted to hire them. And he did, and he wrote, "It has cheered the soldier's heart that while putting comfortable clothing upon our gallant fellows, exposed to the bitter norther and drenching rains, that the making of the garments keeps those he holds dear at home away from speculation and extortioners." And so he kind of was helping these women in hiring them on. So the tailor shop consisted of two parts. It consisted of the cutting branch that cut up the cloth and the issuing branch. And the issuing branch took these bundled suits, sets of clothing, and carried them around to the sewing women in Euston, and they turned them into clothing, and then they picked them up. So the cutting branches and the issuing branches. Now, I've spoken about manpower issues, and so here we go. So who ran the cutting branch in Euston? It was a professional tailor who had been drafted into the Army and then detailed, exempted from field service, a private. He was a private, and so he's running this shop as a private, getting $13 a month, and but he's running everything, and so a little bit haphazard. This is not quite a systematic approach to management, but it's what Wharton had to deal with. So anyway, this is who ran his cutting branch, and then it was a civilian who ran the issuing branch. So typically, let's see if I'm here. So typically, the uniforms that Wharton made at the Euston Depot were from the very start, 1862, right up to May 1865, were almost all, without exception, these cadet gray uniforms. A cadet gray jacket, cadet gray pants, and I've got some pictures. Let's see if I okay. So we don't have any surviving Euston Depot uniforms. There are none that have survived the war, but this is an original Confederate uniform from the Army of Northern Virginia, made of this imported blue-gray cloth. So would have looked something like that. That would have been kind of about what the typical Euston Depot uniform looked like. And that's about what the cap would have looked like. All the caps at Euston had a colored band around them, red for artillery, light blue for infantry, and yellow for cavalry. And then, along with the jacket and pants, they made Osnaburg shirts and drawers, the underclothing. And then, on occasion, some cloth from Huntsville would be allotted to Euston for our garments. So white woolens or white cotton jeans. And again, this is a representative uniform about what that would have looked like, this white woolen uniform. But it's actually not a Euston uniform, it's a uniform from a depot in Virginia. So, but that's about what the Euston uniform would have looked like. It is an original uniform, white uniform. And here we have some pictures of soldiers actually wearing the Houston Depot uniforms, a couple of them. So we do have some pictures out there of them wearing that. And given that the Houston uniforms were made out of the cadet or Confederate gray cloth and often had the colored facings on them, they were closer to the Confederate regulations than a lot of other uniforms in the Confederacy. So the next operation that Wharton had started, aside from his tailor shop, was his shoe shop. And prior to him opening his shoe shop, Wharton had to get shoes either from local contractors or import them. And throughout the war, it never stopped. In order to meet the demand for footwear, the quartermaster always had to rely on imports and contractors. But Wharton started making government shoes too. And even by the end of the war, I think 60% of all the shoes worn in the Trans-Mississippi were imported British-made shoes. So anyhow, but Wharton wanted to be self-sufficient. He wanted to make his own shoes, so he started a shoe shop. And how would he do that? Well, he couldn't just start making shoes. So in 1862, before he ever opened the shop, he had to establish private tanneries. So he went around the state with his agents, and they fostered the production of new tanneries. And so by late 1862, they were starting to see some of the fruits of their labor, and these tanneries had leather to provide. Texas was quite fortunate. It had a great surplus of cattle. It had a great surplus of leather. So it didn't have a problem in that regard. But the problem had been before that, then once a tannery has its leather, it can sell its leather. And so who's going to pay more, the government agent or the private speculator? Well, of course, the private speculator is going to always outbid the government. And so there was a law enacted that leather producers had to sell first to the government at scheduled prices. And Wharton went around to these tanneries and he said, okay, so here's the deal. You have the choice. You can sell to me at scheduled prices, as is the law, or we will take you and your entire workforce and send you to Walker's Texas Infantry Division. You know what? We'll go ahead and sell at scheduled prices. That's probably a good fit for all of us. Okay, so by late 1862, he had all the leather so he could start making his own shoes. Again, we have this kind of haphazard operation because it was hard to find managers, not just shoemakers. It was hard to find managers because they weren't exempted. A shoemaker might be exempted from the draft, but a good manager, no, he's going to be in the Army. So Wharton oftentimes had to get disabled officers, you know, a guy who's missing a leg or an arm, to be managers in his shop, and it was very hit and miss. And it really caused a lot of problems with his production in his shoe shop until finally he just got lucky and got one of these, an older officer who had been put out of the Army for health reasons, but he was a good man. He just too old and infirm, and he was a good manager, and so that doubled the production. But as we see, you know, manpower and labor shortages were always kind of the ghosts that haunted the Confederate logistics industry. So okay, I must have accidentally hit the button. Okay, so here we go. So what did the Confederate shoe in Houston look like? So it was a pegged, brogan, kind of an over the ankle boot, pegged, not sewn, and it was either single or double width sold. And Texas Longhorn cattle had such thick hides that often shoes could be made single soled because the cattle leather was so thick. So it just depended, if they got a calf, or a real Longhorn cow, and then they could, that's how they sold. Now, why would they peg things back then? Well, the best way to sew shoes together was with waxed linen thread, but that was imported. And they couldn't always get waxed linen thread. So, but you could always make pegs, and you could always peg shoes. So that's why the Houston Depot pegged its shoes. And in fact, Wharton even had a soldier who had kind of a mechanical bent, and he invented a peg-making machine that produced the pegs for the Houston Depot that they used. And up in the corner, you can see those pegs, and I found on like a relic site, one of these places that sell Civil War artifacts, that someone was selling original wooden shoe pegs from the Civil War. So I took the pictures so that you could see what they look like, but I guess you can actually still buy them if you want pegs today. And let me see, and so there were two kinds of shoes. I mentioned the brogans for the Army, and then there was also what they called a Negro shoe. And why would they even make two shoes? Well, because blacks had different shaped foot, and so they actually there were so many blacks in Confederate service there, 20% of the force, so they made special shoes for them. And so that's what they did. And at the end of November 1863, the shoe making operation was moved to Milliken, Texas because of the threat of invasion, and it wasn't moved back to Houston until like the winter of 1864-65. So that was the second big shop that they had. The next operation or shop or factory that Wharton built was his tin shop. And again, he wanted to produce tinware for the Confederate Army and avoid expensive contracts. And so once again, we get, okay, so how are we going to find a tinsmith? So as it so happened, there was a tin shop factory in Galveston, Texas, right before the war. The owner of the factory went into the Army, and Wharton got that man detailed to run the tin shop. So what he did, and it's an interesting story, the man's name was Mr. Grove. He bought with Confederate government funding, he bought the factory in Galveston, had it shipped to Houston, or to Hempstead, and rebuilt, and then the man who ran it as the president of the company before the war was brought in to run it now as a private in the Army, making $13 a month, to be the tin shop manager, and he pocketed all the money for the factory, so this private in the Army got paid for the factory. And now he's running the factory, but as a private in the Army. Very, very haphazard way of doing things, but this is how things worked in the Confederate Army. But it worked. And so once they got the tin shop operating, the main thing that they made was camp kettles and mess pans. So a camp kettle is like a big pot with a lid that they could boil food in. And a mess pan was like kind of a large frying pan with a lid so that they could fry up stuff. They also made canteens, plates, cups, drum shells, and miscellaneous articles of hospital and office furniture. And this is what the Confederate canteen looked like, made in Houston. Kind of a round, like drum-shaped canteen. Let's see. And Wharton also wanted to make buttons for his uniforms, so he had cast pewter jacket buttons made. These are examples of those pewter buttons made in the Houston tin shop. They've been dug up by relic hunters. And he had shirt and trouser buttons made of pewter, and these are some that likewise have been dug up at Confederate sites. So, in any case, in November of 1863, the tin shop was established in February of 1863. In November of 1863, Wharton started his a new shop, and this was a foundry. And so this is an actual picture of a Houston foundry. We don't know if it's the government foundry, but it is a foundry in Houston. So I suppose it looked similar to this. And the object was that, again, avoid costly transportation costs and contracts, and produce solid cast iron mess equipment to replace less durable tin mess gear. And the idea was that they would make cast iron pots, also called ovens, with lids, and they would make big iron skillets with lids, and these would replace the tinware. Let's see if I've got some pictures. So this is probably a good example of a cast iron pot. It's all I could find, and you know, skillet. I think the skillets were probably bigger, but that's what I could find. And let me back up. So again, labor shortages, difficult to get the necessary labor and management. So Wharton found a detailed soldier, Thaddeus S. Hammett. He brought him in, a private, to run this whole foundry. And again, we have a private soldier, detailed from the Army, $13 a month. He's running the operation, and within a month or two, Hammett was cranking out hollowware or cast iron mess equipment for much cheaper cost than the Confederate Army was having to pay for it. And he was also refurbishing worn out axes, making corn shellers, and making large kettles for the commissary department and special kettles for a new hat factory. So because they were in Texas, not in Europe where they have access to iron deposits, they really had to rely on scrap iron for their material. And so they would send wagons all over the countryside collecting scrap iron for use in the foundry. And also, again, there was no coal readily available in Texas, so they used charcoal to fire their furnaces. And so this was another renovation that Wharton did. And another requirement that Wharton saw was for hats, and he wanted to start a hat factory. And as Wharton said to General Magruder, a plain but serviceable wool hat of which the troops stand much in need is desirable over the smaller cap. And so Wharton started his hat factory. Again, he had to get a detailed soldier to run it. He found two brothers who were in the 26th Texas Cavalry. He got them detailed out, and you had privates once again running factories. And again, though, there was the labor shortage. So what is he going to do about labor? Well, he says, you know what? we can train our black population to be hatters, and we can train our black population to be shoemakers. And so he started to bring in black laborers and teach them these trades. And so those were the people who would be manning the factories. Again, we have this same nagging problem of the viable teeth to tail ratio. It was just so hard to find the necessary people in the less populous South. So what did these hats look like? Well, this kind of undyed drab hat is what most Southern factories made for their soldiers. Was this. We don't know what the Houston Hat Factory made. We do know it was consolidated with the LaGrange Confederate Hat Factory in the spring of 1864, so it barely got off the ground before it was consolidated. We know that the LaGrange Hat Factory was making cheap black woolen hats, and so this is a Confederate hat that looks probably about like what the hats would have looked like from the Texas, the Depot factory. And then we have one other picture of a Confederate hat, probably made in Confederate Depot somewhere, either in LaGrange or in Monroe, Louisiana. And this is it. It's kind of a pointed hat, and it looks a little bit funny. It's undyed. But when made, the hat didn't have that point. But as the hats deteriorated in the weather, the crown of the hat kind of pooched up to a point because of the way they are made. So that is also another Trans-Mississippi hat that we have that's actually from the department. So one of the few examples. The last venture that Wharton embarked on was to make a cotton and wool factory. So the only really big cotton and wool factory in the Trans-Mississippi was the Huntsville Penitentiary Mill. And there were smaller factories, but Wharton had a dream, let's make our own. And why? Well, for two reasons. One, he wanted to make cloth for uniforms and cotton cloth for various utilitarian purposes. But also, there were no blanket factories anywhere in the Trans-Mississippi, not a single one. So every blanket for the Confederate Army had to be imported. And as a matter of fact, there were only a handful of blanket factories in the whole South at the beginning of the Civil War. So Wharton wanted to make a cotton and wool factory and produce a cheap blanket made with a cotton warp and a woolen weft. And again, he had to man the factory with black labor and train them in the skills to become weavers. And he had Mr. James K. Metcalf, a civilian, to run the factory, who was actually from England and had been in the weaving business before the war. So that was his vision. And what actually happened was, in the spring of 1864, soon after Wharton was trying to get this factory off the ground, the Trans-Mississippi Department decided, well, we're just going to consolidate Wharton's operation with a bigger operation in Tyler, Texas. So, and that was the Mound Prairie Confederate Government Works. So, anyhow, that was that. So, it was Wharton's vision to foster the home industry and make the South self-sufficient, but also to better organize and streamline Confederate industry. And it's not just making stuff, it's organizing and managing what you have. And this is where Wharton really understood the problem. So his vision was to put qualified tradesmen and experienced managers in charge of the workshops and quartermaster bureaus and give them commissions rather than just haphazardly appoint disabled officers, detailed privates, or civilians to run things. And he wanted to commission managers as captains and master tradesmen as lieutenants. And he wanted to give them the prestige of being an officer, the benefits of having the rank and pay, and also make them cavalry officers so that the government would have to pay for their horse, and each of these managers would have a horse. So that was Wharton's vision. And so how did Wharton do? And the question is not just how Wharton did, but how did Southerners do? Interestingly, an English businessman, W.C. Corson, traveling through the South from October through December of 1862, commented on Southern self-sufficiency. And I'll read you his quote. The activity, ingenuity, and energy now directed towards developing the resources of the South emerged first in the spring of 1862, when Southerners realized that foreign intervention would not save them, and they resolved to help themselves. Their country was rich in every kind of raw material, requiring only enough skilled labor to render themselves independent of the foreigner or Yankee. Their infant manufacturing enterprises had to be fostered and expanded. Their resources of cotton, wool, hides, bark, coal, iron, and wood would answer the needs for their native manufacturing, supposing that sufficient skilled labor could be had to operate the factories. The South, however, had few skilled mechanics. Consequently, the male white population was compelled to learn the arts of manufacturing in the crucible of war. Desperate necessity forced the Southern people to develop their latent industry, ingenuity, and ability for manufactures and commerce. They have been compelled to become shoemakers, tailors, cotton spinners, mechanics, and so on. And whether they consider it a compliment or not, it is a fact that there is enough of the Yankee about them to invent and make machines to look uncommonly sharp after making them pay well too. Among the Negroes, male and female, a good deal of mechanical skill exists and is being worked up rapidly. Then again, thousands of young Southern women have taken to work in Richmond and other cities in large clothes, cartridge, or cotton factories. Southern boys are likewise inspired to industry, and when they leave school, they either go to work in the factories or join the Army. Southern folks have woke up, and the old dislike of mechanical employment or labor among white people is dying away. This is one of the good results, which every well-wisher of the South will hope to see grow out of the sad present. And it may have been worth the price if a people so noble as they are purged of some of the great prejudices which in the past have hindered their happiness and progress. Without exaggerating the energy, industry, or ingenuity of the Southern people, nor the fruits of their labor, it is a fact that the South has at last found out that she possesses the raw material and skill necessary to become a manufacturing country, and that these enterprises must increase, and the South will never succumb for one of the necessities of life and war, either in food, clothing, arms, or ammunition. The growth of these manufacturing interests will have an important influence on the future tariff of the Confederacy. And indeed, the South was successful at raising its industry up from nothing and moving towards self-sufficiency. And as I said, while the enemy laid waste our lands, they never extinguished the spirit for ingenuity and self-sufficiency that the Southerners, that awoke in the Southern people. And so after the war, that continued on. That was part of what we walked away from the war with. So, despite all of Wharton's accomplishments, he did fall prey to bureaucratic infighting. And what happened is, so when Kirby Smith took over the Trans-Mississippi in February of 1863, he set up his own bureaucracy. And part of this was he set up a new clothing bureau under Major William H. Haynes. And ever the kind of persnickety commander, Magruder had to assert himself as being in charge. And so he approached Kirby Smith and said, well, we've already got our own clothing bureau here, and we don't need to, we can run our own show. And so just worry about Arkansas and Louisiana. And Kirby Smith was irritated, but said, oh, okay, then y'all just do that. Y'all run your own show. But that wasn't good enough for Magruder. He had to promote Wharton to a major, which was a direct affront to the major who ran the departmental clothing bureau. And so now you've got Kirby Smith and Major Haynes, who are offended by Magruder, and now who are they going to take it out on? They're going to take it out on Wharton, who's been promoted to major. And the problem was, of course, Wharton had a provisional commission. So, Kirby Smith told Magruder, well, your clothing bureau chief doesn't even have a Confederate commission. And so the problem started. And one of the problems was that Kirby Smith put a big audit on Wharton, which was complete harassment, but it was this bureaucratic infighting. And Wharton just resigned in January of 1864 and went on, and was put kind of on bureau duty. So what happened is Magruder had been fighting, well, let's go ahead and make him a captain again and get him, back on board. In fact, make him a major. Well, 9 days after Wharton resigned because he felt like he was being harassed, the Secretary of War, Seddon, finally approved Wharton's regular commission in the Confederate Army. Sent that to Kirby Smith, and what did Kirby Smith do with that commission? Just put it in his desk. And Seddon said, did you get Wharton's commission? Well, I don't know. So Seddon sent another commission, and Kirby Smith put that in his desk. And finally, in February of 1865, I guess Kirby Smith needed someone to help out in Houston, so he gave Wharton his commission. Wharton got his commission, but it was just a lot of contention and harassment there. So in the end, you could say that although Wharton kind of ended the war as an officially commissioned captain of quartermaster, he was not especially appreciated by his superiors in the Trans-Mississippi Department. So that brings us past our first quartermaster officer, who had obviously done much to foster production and operations in the department. We come briefly to our next quartermaster officer, and that's Captain William J. Mills. So Mills had worked for Wharton since early 1862. He was provisionally commissioned a captain, again, provisional commission. And he had a very interesting career. So he was from Florida, and during the Florida War, he served as an officer. And it was during the Florida War that he met Magruder and got to know him. So when he got, so in Houston, they knew each other, and Magruder trusted him. He knew him from the Indian Seminole War in Florida, I guess it was. And so, you know, there was that connection. Mills was a man of some standing. He moved from Florida to Texas during the Republic days, and he immediately started moving up. He became an officer in the Republic of Texas Army, and from there he was made the Texas ambassador to England. So you know, he was an accomplished man of some standing. When the Texas Republic was no more, he returned from England. He worked his plantation and also served as a postmaster. And when the war broke out, he was Mills was. I think he was 63 years old when the war started. So normally, you know, a wealthier man, a successful man, 63 years old, he would bid the troops a fond adieu and then go about his business. But no, not Mills. He joined an infantry regiment in the Texas State Forces and went into the field with them, but his health he just could not handle that kind of a life. So he was discharged from the infantry at 63, and he sought out the Houston Quartermaster, and there his organizational and managerial skills they found a home, and he was put in charge of the Houston Clothing Bureau, the manufacturing part of it. And this is what Wharton had to say about Mills, who was in fact promoted to head of the Houston Bureau on the 10th of July, 1863. His business experience, integrity, punctuality, industriousness, and zeal led me to select him as my right-hand man. And so Mills was provisionally made a captain and put in charge. As it turned out, so Mills came down sick in October of 1863 due to exposure to inclement weather. And while he was really suffering in the hospital, Kirby Smith sent him word that he was turning down his commission. He was not going to forward it to Richmond, and that you know, just like reprising against Wharton, he was going to reprise against Mills by not commissioning him. So this is what Wharton related. He said, towards the last days of October, Mills was taken very ill from overexertion and exposure to inclement weather. On the 31st of October, notification reached him, while very low, that the president had declined confirming his appointment. And a few days later he died, muttering in his delirium about the mortification placed on an old soldier so unexpectedly. The Confederacy has but few more ardent and unselfish patriots or more valuable citizens. So Mills was denied his well-earned commission, and he died of this heartbreak, you could say, on the 4th of November, 1863. So that concludes the story of these two Unsung Southern Patriots. Each contributed to the Southern War effort in his own way. And each of them suffered from an ungrateful bureaucracy, yet each advanced the Southern cause, and each left a legacy of sustainment to the Army and a legacy of industry that outlived the Southern defeat on the battlefield. And at the end of it all, both Edward C. Wharton and William J. Mills lived up to the honor that they too served, and they're remembered. So thank you. That was my talk.